Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jack Kartez. I'm the director of the US EPA Region 1 New England Environmental Finance Center, and I've been at the University of Southern Maine in the Portland, Maine area for the last 20 years as a faculty member, more recently in the Edmund S. Muskie School of Public Service, and before that as the founding director of the Environmental Science and Policy degree program at that institution. Prior to that, I was one of the original faculty of the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M University. My involvement in the hazards field, briefly, is that Mount St. Helens erupted and landed in my backyard in Washington State in 1980. And so I began 35 years off and on of National Science Foundation funded research, and as I got into the hazards arena, having started as a land use and community planner in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho in previous years, I began to also become connected with the community of practice. Back in the day, in the 1980s, I helped my practice colleagues Skip Stoffel and Rick Lavala with disaster planning training. They had a program called the Emergency Response Institute based in Olympia, Washington, and they did a lot of work. We did a lot of work with other states like Tennessee, TEMA, whose motto is America's Finest, leading the way. Of course, they have a lot of hazards to deal with, including technological hazards in Tennessee. But I've been a hazards researcher originally focusing on the connection between emergency preparedness and response planning and the other functions of local government, which were not so well connected back during that period in the 1980s even. Things have changed quite a bit. Organizations like the National Natural Hazards Mitigation Association are continuing to innovate and lead the way by creating a very diverse and inclusive community that cuts across many fields. And of course, here today at the 40th Annual Natural Hazards Workshop and this year's Natural Hazards Mitigation Association conference following it, we've been hearing a lot about how those working in climate adaptation and now resilience can be and should be and are being connected with the hazard mitigation community that, of course, has existed for quite some time. But today, I would like to share with my Natural Hazard Mitigation Association colleagues a little information about a program at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency called the Environmental Finance Program, which supports a university-based center in each of EPA's 10 administrative regions, and I'm the director of the one in the New England region, which is Region 1. This is a very small program, and I think it's important to share this with you because, you know, having been a participant at the Natural Hazards Workshop, this great creation of the late Gilbert F. White and others, which has brought researchers of all stripes and practitioners and public agency officials together for many years. I've been involved in it for 35 years. One thing that I've noticed over that long period of time is that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has not been a very frequent participant, and yet, of course, you know, we've had much participation from USGS and, of course, FEMA and now Homeland Security, and at various times from NOAA, Interior even, the Corps of Engineers, of course, and sometimes U.S. DOT and Federal Highway, who I've had much more contact with lately on other projects. So I think it's important to make this connection, and I want to tell you today about a fundamental set of issues in environmental finance that the little program that I'm connected with and the network of centers across the country, we all work together as well as an environmental finance center network. I'd like to tell you about this set of issues in environmental finance which actually bear on our work as hazard mitigators and people who work with the disaster cycle and its demands on our friends, neighbors, and communities. So what are the issues with environmental finance? The Environmental Finance Center program and another related program at EPA which supports an Environmental Finance Advisory Board, a FACA board for this little program, FACA being the Federal Advisory Commissions Act, which governs these stakeholder groups now that get involved, which have to follow certain rules, you know, for conflict of interest and transparency and so on. The EFAB, Environmental Finance Advisory Board, by the way, involves bond traders, bankers, utility executives, and us planning policy and local and state administration types. So we participate in it as the Environmental Finance Centers, and it deals with looking at policy issues, some of which I'm going to tell you about. Why is this important? The Environmental Finance Program was the brainstorm of a past comptroller of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, who said, you know, we have all these regulatory programs and we're doing lots of science at EPA, but where do we figure out how to pay for this stuff, particularly because states, and to some degree they thought at the time, much more than they knew, localities have to pay for all this. So the Environmental Finance Center system is focused on the often overlooked question of how to pay for environmental improvements of all kinds, because that's the issue. So this is a looming problem, often overlooked, as I said. Let me connect it to our concerns as natural hazard professionals and researchers as well. We're here in Boulder, Colorado. The 2013 floods, of course, were quite a difficult event with quite a bit of loss and damage. The Boulder Creek flood control system that's been worked on here for many decades was robust and did a lot of good, but there was other flooding that occurred. And the interesting thing about that is, as some people have characterized it to me, who are very well familiar with the 2013 flood here in Boulder, the 8 days of rain, it was a stormwater event. So stormwater finance and management is one of the focal issues for my Environmental Finance Center and others across the country, because localities are the first line of defense for stormwater management, and the number of localities across the country that must address stormwater management, the 6 minimum control measures under NPDES Phase 2 of the Clean Water Act, the Water Pollution Control Act, which expanded the number of communities affected and required to comply, localities have to pay for that. So we are deeply involved, as I speak, in working with localities to promote the use of known mechanisms for paying for stormwater, advanced stormwater management, such as stormwater utilities, where you might get a fee if you have a roof. It might come with your property tax bill. It might come with your water bill, depending on the state and local jurisdiction involved and the practices there. But we're also looking for new mechanisms, because we do not have enough money just to cover stormwater. Well, I think it's easy to see, particularly for hazard professionals and mitigators, that stormwater is connected to flooding hazards and landslide, unstable landscape hazards, and other kinds of hazards as well, including health hazards. So there's a connection here. How to pay is a vital issue. Well, one of the things about the natural hazard relief and recovery and preparedness system in the United States under the Stafford Act and its predecessors, and of course the DMA of 2000, is that a lot of the financial aspects are focused on federal relief, and the hazard mitigation policies and programs in place now, which have been in advance, are still tied to post-disaster relief, so that you will get more if you have a hazard mitigation plan in place that locally, which is compliant with a state hazard mitigation plan, which hopefully is an extended one or enhanced one. But the kind of environmental finance I'm talking about falls squarely on local government and their states. So let me give you an example or two of innovations in this area. Stormwater utilities, asking people to pay because of the square footage of the roof or the parking lots and so on, residential and commercial. That was an innovation when it started to come in. But even in New England, where there's quite a bit of concern about that, my EPA region staff that I have to report to as a university-based center, and all of the EFCs are university-based, I'm not an EPA employee, they are concerned that they don't have enough stormwater utilities, even though this is an area of quite a bit of activity throughout New England localities and their overlying state governments. So we need more of this. So here is an example of an innovation of the type that maybe, I think, will be important to hazard management and resilience in the future as we all work on it with our expanding interconnected communities. The city of Berkeley in 2008 decided that they wanted to go solar electric on the roofs of their homeowners and businesses in the city. But of course, that's a very large expense to put up front. So what they did was to float a revenue bond with, of course, the usual voter approval and council sponsorship that would allow them to provide the public funds up front that would be paid back by the private recipients, who then would be able to spend the tens of thousands of dollars necessary to buy and install the solar photovoltaic electric systems on the roofs. And so they created an instrument that's mortgage-like, that was amortized over a decade and more. And the landowners, property owners paid this back through their annual property tax bills. The city of Palm Springs, California, did this at the same time, and this program, which was known as FIRST, Financing Renewable Solar Technology, has then been replicated across the country. So that's an example of using public funds temporarily to leverage private investment. US EPA is very concerned about fostering what they call P3 in the local jargon in that world, public-private partnerships, 3 Ps. And this is an example of how public financing mechanisms can be used to enable, not to substitute for, but enable the private investment that we need. In the hazards field, we're going to have to find methods like this to be able to pay for the kinds of climate adaptation and hazard mitigation measures and actions that we know are going to be needed, particularly to deal with a non-stationary climate. So the message is simply that the finance people, who often seem kind of behind the scenes and may not be all that hooked into the kinds of activities and functions that we're engaged in, are very important. And I would encourage you in your states to find out where the Environmental Finance Center is in your region. They're university-based. There's one in each of EPA's administrative regions in the country. Thank you.